The spit landed on my dress before the music ever started. I was standing in a corridor off the main hall of the church 20 years ago, wearing a gown I had saved 11 months to buy. Stellan's family was arranged in front of me, not gathered, arranged. The way people position themselves when they have already made a decision and want you to feel it before they say it. His aunts, his uncles, cousins, whose names I had practiced pronouncing because I wanted them to know I was trying. And Dorinda at the front, her chin lifted, her eyes moving over me the way you look at something you are deciding whether to step around or step on. She stepped forward. "We don't do black pigs like you." She did not whisper it. She delivered it, cleanly, in front of every person in that corridor. And then she spat. Not metaphorically. She spat on my dress, on the 11 months I had saved, on the woman standing inside it. I did not move. I did not speak. I stood exactly where I was, and I looked at every face in that corridor. The ones that flinched, the ones that looked at the floor, the ones that found something on the wall suddenly very interesting. I filed every single one of them, not from anger, from clarity. I wanted to know exactly who was in that hallway and exactly what they chose when it cost them something to choose differently. Stellan came around the corner 30 seconds too late. I watched his face collapse when he understood what had happened. He reached for me and I let him hold my hand, but I did not lean into him. I was still standing. I intended to keep standing. We married that day. We walked down that aisle and we said those words, and I smiled in every photograph because I had not come that far to let Dorinda's 30 seconds define the rest of my hours. My name is Marvine Alcott. I want you to know that before we go any further, before I tell you what happened 20 years later when that same woman showed up at my door, I am not a woman who collapses easily. I built a commercial real estate firm from a single property acquisition in Birmingham, Alabama, and I did not stop acquiring until my company went public this year at $250 million. I started with clarity about where I was going, and I never once put that down. If you are just settling in, whatever time it is where you are, I am glad you are here. Stay with me. This story is worth your time. 20 years passed between that corridor and this morning. 20 years of building something out of nothing, of raising 2 children, of sharing a bed with a man I love, who carries his own weight of what his family did and never quite learned how to put it down either. This morning, I was sitting at my desk on the 14th floor of a building with my name on it when my assistant knocked twice and stepped inside. "Mrs. Alcott." She paused the way people pause when they are uncertain how the next sentence will land. "There's a woman at the front entrance. She's asking for your home address." I did not ask who it was. I already knew. She hadn't thought about that corridor in years. She thought about it now. She knocked on my door like she had done it 100 times before, not hesitant, not apologetic. 3 clean knocks, evenly spaced, the kind that assume the door will open. I stood in my hallway for exactly 3 seconds before I moved toward it, not because I needed to compose myself, but because I wanted to be certain of what my face was doing before she saw it. I opened the door. 20 years had redistributed Dorinda in the way time redistributes people who have spent most of it indoors. Softer at the jaw, heavier at the shoulders, the lines around her mouth cut deeper than I remembered. She was wearing a pressed navy blouse and dark slacks. Her hair was set. She had dressed for this. That told me something. Her eyes moved past me before she said a word, across the entryway, into the living room, up toward the staircase, not admiring, cataloging. taking inventory of what 20 years of my labor had produced, measuring it against whatever number she had already decided it represented. "Marvine," she said. Like we had spoken last week, I stepped back and let her in. I did not hug her. I did not smile. I walked her to the sitting room and I sat across from her and I waited. I have learned over 20 years of closing real estate deals that the person who speaks first in a silent room almost always gives away more than they intended. I had nothing to give away. I waited. She opened her purse and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us. I did not reach for it. I let it sit there while she explained it. 3 things. First, financial assistance with medical expenses the family had accumulated. She named a figure. Second, formal reintegration into family events going forward, holidays, milestones. She used the word naturally, as though it were the obvious next step. Third, a public acknowledgement from both sides that the estrangement had been mutual. That distance had grown between 2 families who had both chosen to step back. I kept my eyes on her face through all of it. She did not look away, but she blinked more than necessary, which told me the silence I was holding was costing her something. That third point was the one I locked onto and did not let go of internally. Mutual. She had constructed an entire version of 20 years in which I had participated equally in the silence, in which the woman who spat on my wedding dress and the woman wearing it had made the same decision together and simply drifted apart. I said nothing about any of it. I stood up and walked to the kitchen and I made 2 cups of coffee. I brought them back and I set one in front of her and I sat down again. She accepted it. She wrapped both hands around that cup, my cup, in my house, poured from my kitchen. And she drank from it without a pause, without acknowledgement, without a single moment of awareness about what it meant that she was comfortable enough to receive from me. That was the most important thing she showed me that afternoon. Not the list. That. When she left 20 minutes later, the paper was still on the table. I walked her to the door and closed it behind her and came back to the sitting room and stood over that list for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and photographed it. She left the list behind. I left it exactly where it was. Evidence doesn't belong in the trash. I told Stellan that evening after dinner. Not dramatically. I did not walk into the room carrying outrage. I carried information. There is a difference. I sat across from him at the kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, and I walked him through the afternoon piece by piece. Dorinda at the door, the way her eyes moved through my house before she properly looked at me, the folded paper placed carefully between us, the 3 demands, the coffee she drank from my kitchen without hesitation. I watched his face while I spoke. What I expected was surprise. What I saw instead was recognition arriving too early. His jaw tightened halfway through the story, not in shock, but in the specific discomfort of a man hearing details he had already been standing near internally before the words reached the room. He let me finish. Then he sat there longer than necessary afterward, staring at the table instead of at me. That was when I knew whatever came next was not going to be simple. Then he said it. Reed called me 4 days ago. The room went very still. I did not interrupt him. I had already learned early in our marriage that Stellan speaks most honestly when silence forces him to keep going. She'd been talking to people before she came, he said carefully. Reed said she was asking questions about you, about the company, about whether enough time had passed. He swallowed once before continuing. He told me she was planning to reach out. I kept my eyes on him. 4 days. 4 ordinary mornings beside each other in the same kitchen. 4 evenings moving through the same rooms. 4 days of him carrying knowledge about his mother approaching my life again, while I moved through those same days, completely unaware of the shape already walking toward me. Then he said the part that actually changed the room. I answered one of her calls. I felt something inside me stop moving. Not break. Stop. He still wasn't looking directly at me. 2 nights before she came here. His voice had gone quieter now. She wanted to know if she should come. The silence after that sentence had weight to it. I sat completely still and let him continue. I told her I couldn't stop her if she decided to. A pause. And I told her if she came into this house with disrespect again, it would be the last time she ever saw me. There it was. Not betrayal exactly. Something more complicated. A private conversation. A private warning. A private attempt to manage impact before it reached me. All conducted without my knowledge by the man sitting 3 feet away from me at our kitchen table. I looked at him carefully then. You spoke to her, I said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. His eyes closed briefly. Just once. I thought I could handle it before it reached you. That sentence landed harder than the phone call itself, because suddenly I could see it. 20 years of Stellan quietly standing between 2 worlds trying to absorb damage before it reached either side fully. 20 years of managing his family's shame privately. 20 years of deciding what to tell me, what not to tell me, what could be solved quietly before it entered our life directly, not maliciously, protectively. But protection conducted without permission eventually starts resembling secrecy from the outside. I sat with that realization longer than I sat with the call itself. You watched her walk up to our door, I said finally, already knowing she might come. He nodded once, not defensive, not argumentative, just honest enough now to stop protecting himself inside the conversation. I kept hoping she'd lose her nerve. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, because only a man raised by Dorinda would understand that courage and audacity were not the same thing. I stood up from the table. He looked up at me then for the first time since the conversation started, and what I saw on his face was not fear that I would yell. Stellan had never been afraid of yelling. What sat on his face instead was the realization that he had finally allowed me to see one of the hidden systems he had been operating inside our marriage for years. I went upstairs without another word. The next morning, I woke before him and made coffee. Habit survives tension longer than people expect. Stellan came into the kitchen already carrying the look of a man who had not slept properly. He poured coffee. He stood there for a moment with both hands around the mug, like he was warming something deeper than his fingers. Then he said, quietly, I'm calling her. I did not tell him to. He stepped outside with his phone, and I watched him through the glass door above the sink. He stood completely still while the phone rang, shoulders straight, head slightly lowered, the posture of a man preparing himself to say something irreversible to someone who once defined the architecture of his entire life. The call lasted 11 minutes. When he came back inside, he set the phone carefully on the counter and stood looking out the kitchen window for several seconds before speaking. I told her she made a decision 20 years ago, he said, and we built our life around it. I told her our success doesn't rewrite what she did. I looked at him. What did she say? A long pause. She said she thought enough time had passed for everybody to move on. His mouth tightened slightly. And she said she deserved the chance to know her grandchildren before she died. That landed differently than I expected. Not because it moved me, because it revealed something. Dorinda did not think she was walking back into our lives as a villain asking forgiveness. She thought time itself had diluted the debt. Stellan finally turned from the window and looked at me directly. I told her time doesn't erase anything people refuse to name properly. There was something different in him when he said it. Not strength exactly, clarity. And suddenly I understood something I had missed during 20 years of marriage to this man. Stellan was not emotionally simple. He was emotionally compartmentalized. There were rooms inside him I had never fully entered because he had spent most of his adult life handling difficult things privately before they became visible to anyone else, including me. For the first time since I met him, one of those rooms had opened by accident. I did not know yet whether seeing inside it made me feel safer or less safe. That night, I lay beside my husband in the dark and counted every silence I had once mistaken for peace. Corbin found out the way he finds out everything, directly. He called the house the morning after Stellan's phone call to Dorinda, and he asked his father flat out if it was true that his grandmother had come to the door. Stellan told him yes. By that evening, both he and Zuri were sitting in my living room, and I was sitting across from them, understanding that the version of this story I had prepared was about to meet two people who were old enough to test its edges. Corbin went first. He wanted the account, what she said, what she wanted, what we had told her. His father's directness sitting in his son's jaw, his hands loose on his knees, patient but expectant. He was not emotional about it. He was gathering information the way practical men do when they sense a situation developing around them that they have not been briefed on. I gave him the surface of it. Dorinda had come. She had made requests. His father had spoken to her and made our position clear. Corbin nodded, filed it, sat back. Then Zuri spoke. She did not ask about the list or the demands or what Stellan had said on the phone. She asked the question I had been carrying the weight of since she was old enough to notice that her father's side of the family existed only in silence. Mom, why have I never met her? Not angry, not accusing, genuinely asking, the way a 24-year-old woman asks a question she has held politely for years and is now holding out to you with both hands, waiting to see what you will place inside them. I watched my daughter's face and understood something I had not let myself fully measure until that moment. Stellan and I had built a version of events for our children that was careful, restrained, and incomplete. We had told them the estrangement was the family's choice, that it had been painful, that it was behind us. No lies in any of it. Just a curated silence. The kind that protects children when they are small and begins to show its shape when they grow tall enough to see over it. Zuri had grown tall enough. I told her what I had told Corbin. The estrangement was their choice. It was painful. It is in the past. I kept my voice level and my hands still, and I watched her receive it. She did not push. She was her mother's daughter enough to understand that pushing in that moment would close a door she wanted left open. She nodded. She asked nothing further, but her eyes stayed with the question. Steady, quiet, sitting just behind whatever expression she arranged for my benefit. That look did not leave the room when she did. I sat alone in my kitchen after they had gone, and I held that look in my chest, and I turned it over slowly. My children were not small anymore. Whatever I walked toward next, they would be walking toward it too, not behind me, beside me, close enough to be touched by whatever came through any door I chose to open. The question was not whether to let Dorinda back in. The question was whether I could build the architecture of that exposure carefully enough to keep them from being harmed inside it. I made my decision before I turned off the kitchen light. Not from sentiment, not from forgiveness. From the look on my daughter's face. My daughter didn't push. She didn't have to. That look stayed with me long after she left the room. I found him in the garage on a Saturday morning. He was doing the thing he does when something is sitting on him, reorganizing tools that were already organized, moving things from one shelf to another with the focused energy of a man who needs his hands busy so his mind can work. I had watched him do it for 20 years. I knew what it meant. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, and I did not ease into it. I will not let them make me into something my children have to survive. He stopped, set down what he was holding, turned to look at me. I told him what I had seen on Zuri's face 3 days ago, not the question she asked, but what was sitting underneath it. The look of a young woman who had just realized that her own history had a locked room in it, and that the people holding the key had decided, a long time ago, that she was not old enough to know why. That look was not confusion. It was the beginning of a young woman understanding that her identity had edges she had never been allowed to examine. That was what I was protecting against, not my own wound. I had been carrying that for 20 years, and I knew its weight well enough to manage it. This was about my daughter's future relationship with who she was, with who we were, with what she would conclude about herself if she spent another decade growing up in a silence that had the shape of shame. Stellan listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he did not speak. He turned back to the shelf and stood there with both hands resting on the edge of it, and I watched the muscles across his shoulders work through something invisible. I left him there. I did not press. I went back inside and I gave him what he needed, room to arrive somewhere on his own. He carried it for 3 days. I watched him move through the house differently during those 3 days. Quieter at meals, slower to respond when spoken to, present in the body, but somewhere else behind the eyes. 20 years of guilt about his family had been something he managed in private, tucked away in whatever room he kept locked inside himself. Now it was sitting on the surface of him, and he did not quite know where to put it. I did not help him put it anywhere. Some things have to be felt fully before a person can decide what to do with them. I had learned that the hard way. I let him learn it on his own terms. On the 4th morning, he came to the kitchen while I was making coffee. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just stood there. And then he said it. "Okay, Marvin." 2 words. Quiet, not relieved, not resolved, careful. The voice of a man who has made a decision he understands the full weight of and is not pretending otherwise. I poured his coffee and set it in front of him, and I sat down across from him and I looked at my husband. His yes was real. I did not doubt that. But I heard what was underneath it. The fragility of a man who had agreed to open a door he was not certain he could close again if what came through it caused damage he could not undo. I accepted his yes exactly as it was. I did not press on what was underneath it, but I noted it. I would be watching. He said yes. I heard everything underneath it that he didn't say. I called Dorinda on a Tuesday morning from my office, not from home. From my office, deliberately, with Birmingham stretched outside the windows and my name fixed to the side of the building in steel letters 4 floors below me. I wanted to be sitting inside the full architecture of my own life when I made that call. I wanted every decision I had made over the last 20 years, standing quietly behind me while I spoke. She answered on the 3rd ring. I did not begin with pleasantries. I told her I had given serious thought to what a path forward might actually require, and that I was open to restoration. I chose that word carefully. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness. Restoration implied structure, labor, accountability, something damaged being rebuilt correctly instead of emotionally bypassed. She was silent for a moment after I said it. I could hear the shift in her breathing. Small, but there. Hope entering cautiously before she allowed herself to trust it fully. Then I gave her the condition. A gathering. Not private, not symbolic. Family. Specifically the people who had been standing in that corridor 20 years ago when she spat on me and decided publicly what kind of woman I was allowed to be in their family. Those people needed to be in the room. And Dorinda needed to speak. No written statement. No prepared apology. No carefully revised family version. Her own words, accurate words, spoken aloud in front of the same witnesses who had carried the altered version of events for 2 decades. The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. Not shock, calculation. Then came the resistance, measured at first. She said reopening old wounds publicly served no purpose, that the family had already moved on emotionally years ago, that everyone involved was older now, and there was no reason to drag painful things back into the center of the room after so much time had passed. I let her finish. Then I repeated the condition exactly as I had stated it. No adjustment, no softening. The resistance sharpened after that, not loudly. Dorinda rarely became loud when she felt threatened socially. She became dignified, controlled, the kind of control people mistake for reasonableness if they are not listening carefully enough underneath it. She said she was willing to apologize privately. She said she would acknowledge mistakes. She said there were ways to move forward without humiliating people unnecessarily. There it was. Not remorse, management. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window while she spoke. Dorinda, I said finally, you are still trying to negotiate around the exact part that matters. Silence. Then she asked me something that told me more than anything else she had said so far. Is this what you want your children seeing? I almost admired the precision of it. Not direct manipulation, concern-shaped pressure. An attempt to reposition herself as the adult protecting family peace while quietly suggesting that I was the one choosing conflict. Except she had misjudged something fundamental. My children already inherited the silence, I said calmly. What they haven't inherited yet is the truth spoken properly in front of the people who helped bury it. That landed. I heard it land in the sudden stillness afterward. Then she tried once more, this time softer. She asked whether a smaller dinner might accomplish the same thing. Immediate family only. No extended relatives. No revisiting details publicly in front of people who had their own lives and complications now. Again, management. Still trying to preserve survivable versions of herself inside the room. I understood then that the condition itself was not the real difficulty for Dorinda. The real difficulty was accuracy. Accuracy strips away emotional editing. Accuracy forces people to sit inside proportions they did not choose. And for 20 years, Dorinda had survived by controlling proportion, making the estrangement feel mutual, complicated, regrettable from both sides instead of what it actually was. A decision she made and maintained until proximity to my success made the cost of that decision impossible for her to keep rationalizing cleanly. I repeated the condition one final time. Then I told her she should take whatever time she needed before answering. And I ended the call. What I did not say aloud, because I did not need to, was that the room full of witnesses mattered more than the apology itself ever could. People think shame lives inside private memory. It doesn't. It lives inside collective agreement. Dorinda had spent 20 years managing collective agreement carefully. Family members who had once been uncomfortable eventually settled into the easier story, because easier stories survive longer socially. The estrangement became unfortunate, mutual, sad. One of those things that simply happened over time. That lie had calcified because no one important ever interrupted it publicly. I intended to interrupt it properly. 4 days passed, then 6, then 8. I heard through Reed during that period that things inside the extended family were becoming more strained financially than Dorinda originally admitted during the visit with the list. Medical bills had expanded. Insurance complications. One of her brothers had apparently refused additional assistance after years of carrying disproportionate responsibility already. Pressure was building. But interestingly, Dorinda still did not call. That mattered to me. Because if this had only been about money, she would have folded quickly. Instead, she resisted, which meant some part of her still understood the real cost of what I was asking for. On the 9th day, she called briefly, not to agree, to test the edges one final time. She asked whether every person from that corridor truly needed to be there. I said yes. She asked whether exact language mattered after 20 years. I said especially after 20 years. She grew quiet after that. Tired quiet this time. Not defensive quiet. Then she asked me something unexpected. Did you think about that day all these years? I looked down at my desk for a moment before answering. No, I said honestly. I thought about what it revealed. She said nothing after that. The call ended 2 minutes later. 3 days after that, she called again. Her voice sounded older somehow, not weak, just less armored. She said she would do it. No argument this time, no negotiating, no reframing, just acceptance spoken plainly. I thanked her and told her I would contact everyone personally with the details. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office for a long time, looking out at the city. She had agreed on the 12th day. But the important thing was this. She stopped trying to change the shape of the truth before she finally said yes. I scheduled the dinner for a Saturday evening 3 weeks after Dorinda agreed to my condition. 15 people. Not chosen casually, chosen carefully. I went back to that church corridor in my mind and walked through it slowly, face by face, until I could remember exactly who had been standing there when my life divided itself into before and after. The aunt who looked at the floor, the uncle who suddenly became fascinated by the wallpaper, the cousins whose names I had practiced repeatedly in my apartment before the wedding, because I wanted his family to understand that I was trying. I invited all of them. I also invited 2 of Stellan's longtime colleagues, men who had known us as a couple for over a decade, and whose presence mattered because they understood the shape of our marriage outside family mythology. And I invited Clara Whitmore. That decision was deliberate. Clara had lived 4 houses down from Dorinda for nearly 30 years. Church committees, neighborhood fundraisers, holiday drives, garden club luncheons. She was one of those women whose opinion carried quiet weight in communities built around long memory and social consistency. More importantly, Clara was one of the people Dorinda respected enough to edit herself around instinctively. Not feared, respected. There is a difference. I arranged the seating myself, planned the menu myself, controlled every detail I reasonably could because I understood something important going into that evening. Truth without structure often dissolves into emotion before anybody fully absorbs it. I did not want emotion. I wanted accuracy. Dorinda arrived wearing navy again. She favored it whenever she needed composure. Over the past few months, I had started noticing how often she chose it before situations requiring social control. She greeted people carefully at the door. Not warmly, exactly. Measured. I watched her move through the room and understood immediately that she had prepared herself for difficulty, but not for uncertainty. Those are different burdens. Difficult things can be rehearsed internally. Uncertainty cannot. The room filled gradually with the strange politeness people carry into gatherings where everybody senses significance without fully understanding its proportions yet. Conversation moved cautiously at first, then easier around the edges. Wine glasses filled, dinner plates passed, small stories exchanged. Underneath all of it sat awareness. Waiting. After the main course, I folded my napkin once and looked toward Dorinda. That was all. No speech introducing her. No theatrical setup. Just the signal we had already agreed upon privately. She stood slowly. And to her credit, she honored the condition exactly. No prepared statement. No note cards. No emotionally polished language designed for easy survival afterward. She stood at the table and looked directly at the people who had occupied that corridor 20 years earlier, and she began speaking plainly. She named the wedding day, named the hallway, named the words, not softened versions, the actual words. Several people at the table lowered their eyes immediately when she repeated them aloud. One cousin reached automatically for her water glass without drinking from it afterward. Dorinda kept going. She described the silence that followed the wedding, not as misunderstanding, not as complicated distance, as choice. She admitted she had spent years telling herself stories that made the estrangement feel principled instead of cruel. That Marvin was not right for Stellan, that the family had standards, that time would eventually prove her justified. She did not cry while saying any of it. That mattered too. People often mistake emotional collapse for sincerity, but the truth is most genuine reckonings happen much quieter than that. Dorinda's voice only changed in very specific places, the places where the sentence cost her something personally to finish. Those were the parts I trusted most. The room stayed almost completely still while she spoke. No interruptions, no rescuing, no comforting noises people make when they become uncomfortable with truth lasting too long in open air. I sat with my hands folded loosely in my lap and let the moment exist exactly as it was. Not cold, not forgiving, present. I had waited 20 years for accurate language to be attached publicly to what happened in that corridor. I was not going to dilute the moment by performing emotional generosity on cue, simply because the room had become uncomfortable carrying it. So I received it quietly. The way you receive something that should have been given properly a long time ago. Across the table, I felt Stellan looking at me before I turned toward him. His expression had changed over recent months in ways subtle enough that most people probably would not have noticed unless they loved him closely. The guilt inside him no longer looked frantic or defensive. It looked clearer now, more useful, like a man finally understanding that shame hidden privately too long eventually becomes another form of silence. He reached under the table and rested his hand lightly over mine. I let it stay there. Dorinda finished speaking and sat back down. The room exhaled almost imperceptibly afterward. Not relief, exactly. Reorientation. People adjusting themselves internally after hearing something spoken accurately that had lived distorted inside family memory for years. Conversation resumed eventually, but differently now. Softer, more careful. Like everyone understood instinctively that the evening had crossed some invisible threshold and could not return to ordinary social rhythm afterward, no matter how politely they tried. At one point, I looked toward Clara, not dramatically, just once. She was cutting her food into very small pieces with deliberate concentration, her posture still perfectly composed. But she had gone unusually quiet. Earlier in the evening, she had spoken easily about church renovations and grandchildren and neighborhood politics. Now, she said almost nothing. And I noticed something else. She never looked directly at Dorinda again for the remainder of the night. Not out of hostility, out of recalibration. That was the thing people misunderstand about social consequence. Most of the time, it does not arrive loudly. No public exile, no dramatic condemnation, just subtle repositioning. A person realizing they no longer understand someone the same way they did an hour earlier. Dorinda noticed it too. I could tell by the way her eyes moved once toward Clara near dessert, and then away again almost immediately afterward. Some losses don't announce themselves when they enter the room. Sometimes they simply sit down quietly and stay. The first gathering happened on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the dinner. I cooked, not because I needed to demonstrate anything, because this was my house and I do not surrender the center of my home to people who have not yet learned how to stand inside it properly. I seasoned the roast myself, set the table myself, folded the linen napkins myself. By the time the doorbell rang, the house already carried the settled warmth of a place fully occupied by the life built inside it. I opened the door before Stellan could reach it. Dorinda stood beside him holding a pie dish covered carefully with foil. That stopped me for half a second. Not because of the pie itself, because of the choice. 20 years ago, she would have arrived expecting to be served. The woman standing at my door now had brought something with her and was holding it with both hands, like she was not entirely certain what gesture was appropriate anymore. "I made peach cobbler," she said. Not performative, not overly warm, just factual. I stepped aside and let them in. I watched her cross the threshold carefully. The first time she entered this house, she moved through it like someone conducting an assessment. Her eyes cataloged value immediately: the staircase, the molding, the art placement, the architecture of money. That visit had carried appetite underneath it. This one carried caution. Not humility exactly. Dorinda was not a naturally humble woman, but caution, yes. She paused briefly near the entry table where several framed photographs sat arranged together. Corbin at his college graduation, Zuri at 16 holding debate trophies, Stellan standing beside me during the company's opening ceremony years before the IPO. Dorinda's eyes settled on one particular photograph longer than the others. A school Christmas concert. Zuri couldn't have been older than 8. Stellan was crouched beside her, adjusting the hem of her dress while she laughed at something outside the frame. Dorinda looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before moving on. Small things tell the truth first. I cataloged all of it. What she touched, the back of the chair offered to her, the edge of the kitchen counter when she passed it, the pie dish she kept repositioning unnecessarily whenever conversation stalled. What she did not touch, the framed IPO announcement on the wall, the photographs she had not earned history inside, the spaces carrying evidence of years she had voluntarily missed. That mattered too. Corbin was already there when they arrived. He stood and shook her hand politely, and she received him with immediate warmth. Both hands around his, voice softened slightly. Questions about work, prepared in advance. She had researched enough to know where to begin with my son. Smart. Corbin answered carefully, but not coldly. He had inherited his father's ability to remain courteous while withholding emotional access entirely. Dorinda noticed it too. I could tell by the extra half-second she held eye contact after each answer, testing whether another layer would open if she waited long enough. It didn't. Then she turned toward Zuri, and something changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I saw it. Dorinda straightened slightly before speaking to her, like a woman unconsciously preparing herself before stepping into unfamiliar emotional terrain. The confidence she used with Corbin wasn't there in quite the same way. There was more care in her wording, more listening between sentences. Zuri made it easy for her. That was my daughter. Open-faced in ways I had spent years trying unsuccessfully not to admire too much. She asked questions naturally. Where Dorinda grew up, whether Stellan had always hated tomatoes as a child, whether she still attended the church from years ago. Simple questions. Curious questions. The kind asked by someone trying honestly to understand the shape of a person they had spent most of their life imagining from a distance. I watched Dorinda answering them. The first few responses were measured, socially polished, careful, arranged. But somewhere around the story about Stellan hiding report cards inside encyclopedias as a teenager, she laughed unexpectedly in the middle of a sentence. And for one brief moment, the sound that came out of her did not seem managed at all. That caught my attention. So did what happened immediately afterward. She stopped laughing almost as quickly as it started, like the reaction had surprised her too. There it was again. Not transformation, not redemption, disorientation, the emotional equivalent of a person reaching automatically for an old railing and discovering it is no longer where they left it. I stayed across the room and filed every exchange quietly without reacting to any of it. Stellan moved through the afternoon slightly outside the center of things. Present, steady, but carrying the inward look of a man still recalculating emotional architecture he had depended on for most of his life. I let him move through it at his own pace. Pushing Stellan inward only makes him retreat further. When Dorinda thought no one important was watching her, I watched her face carefully. The inventory was still there. That part had not disappeared. Her eyes still tracked the house in quiet moments. Still measured, still assessed, still paused slightly too long on evidence of stability and success. But underneath it now, there was something newer, occasionally interrupting the calculation. Recognition. Not of wealth, of absence. The photographs did that to her more than anything else. I noticed it every time. Her eyes would move toward them and then away too quickly afterward, like a woman accidentally touching something hot. That was when I understood something important. Dorinda had not come back because she suddenly became a different woman after 20 years. She had come back because proximity was destabilizing the version of the story she had survived inside for 2 decades. And now she was trying to figure out whether there was still enough time left in her life to rearrange herself before it was too late. Dorinda left at 7, carrying the empty pie dish back out to her car. I walked her to the door. She thanked me for dinner. I told her she was welcome. Then I closed the door behind her and stood quietly in my hallway, listening to the silence settle back over the house. Everyone else had seen a family dinner. I had seen the first moment Dorinda looked at what she lost and stopped being fully certain the trade had been worth it. It started gradually enough that I almost respected the restraint behind it. Not daily calls. Not dramatic, emotional overreaching. Dorinda understood better than most people that adults become suspicious when affection arrives too quickly after a long absence. So she approached Corbin the way cautious people approach skittish animals, slowly, consistently, never pushing hard enough to trigger retreat. A call one Tuesday evening, another 4 days later, then a short conversation after church on Sunday. Spaced carefully enough that each interaction could still pass as natural. I noticed the pattern sometime during the 3rd week and said nothing aloud. I simply adjusted my understanding of her again. Dorinda had always understood social pacing instinctively. That part of her had not changed with age. Corbin mentioned the first few conversations casually. The way men like him mention things they have not yet assigned emotional weight to. He was standing in my kitchen, buttoning the sleeve of his coat, when he told me his grandmother had called to check in. They talked for 20 minutes. She asked about work, asked whether he was still skipping breakfast the way he used to during exam weeks in college. He said it with mild amusement more than attachment. The expression of a grown man discovering that somebody had been paying attention to details about him from farther away than he realized. I smiled lightly and told him that sounded nice. Then I watched him leave and stood in my kitchen a little longer than necessary afterward. At that point, I was not worried. Curious, yes. Alert, certainly, but not worried. Because the thing people misunderstand about emotionally intelligent adults is this. We are not easily rewritten all at once. Corbin was not a lonely child, desperate for belonging. He was a grown man with stable footing, a strong sense of himself, and 28 years of life already built before Dorinda ever entered the room properly. What concerned me was not manipulation. It was emotional atmosphere. That took me longer to identify. The shift revealed itself gradually through the texture of later conversations. Not statements exactly. Impressions. Dorinda never lied directly, at least not anymore. She was too careful now for outright fabrication. What she offered instead were emotionally softened proportions. Regret, framed, collectively. Distance described like weather. Silence positioned as something painful that had simply happened to everyone involved over time. Not malicious, not aggressive, which made it more dangerous. Because emotionally mature people do not usually resist narratives that arrive coated in sadness rather than blame. One evening, Stellan came into the den while I was reading and sat down across from me with the particular hesitation of a man still trying to decide whether what he noticed deserves concern or patience. "Corbin's been asking questions," he said. I lowered the book slightly. Questions about when the distance between the families actually started. Questions about birthdays nobody attended. College graduations. Hospital visits after Zuri's appendix surgery when she was 14. Whether there had been attempts at reconciliation over the years that simply never worked out. Not accusations. Not confrontations. Curiosity. That mattered. I listened quietly while Stellan explained that he had answered honestly where he could. Then he paused. Not fully honestly, he corrected softly a second later. There it was. I looked at my husband carefully then. 20 years later, and he still struggled to place certain truths into full sentences when it came to his children. Not because he wanted to protect Dorinda anymore. I understood that now. It was something more damaged and complicated than loyalty. Stellan still carried the reflex of emotional management, the instinct to reduce impact before it reached the people he loved, even when impact deserved its full shape. I watched uncertainty move across his face while he spoke. Not uncertainty about me, about himself, about whether he knew how to help his son navigate this without handing him a version of the family history heavy enough to alter how he saw all of us permanently. That was the part people rarely talk about. Parents do not only protect children from pain. Sometimes we protect them from inheritance. I understood exactly why Stellan hesitated. Because once Corbin fully understood what happened in that corridor 20 years ago, he would never again be able to think about his grandmother without that knowledge standing in the room beside her permanently. I closed my book and set it on the table beside me. "Pay attention to how she explains the silence," I said. Stellan frowned slightly. "Meaning?" "Whether she talks about choices," I said calmly, "or circumstances." That landed. He sat with it for a moment before nodding once. I picked my book back up but did not continue reading after he left the room. The truth was, I had already considered telling Corbin everything directly 3 separate times that week. Not dramatically, not as punishment, but because part of me feared what prolonged vagueness could become if Dorinda kept reshaping emotional proportions before anybody corrected them properly. Each time I imagined the conversation, though, I stopped at the same point internally. Not because I was afraid of honesty, because I refused to hand my son my humiliation in a form that required him to carry it emotionally for me. There is a difference between truth and emotional conscription. Too many parents confuse the two. By Friday, I could feel something settling inside Corbin even before he walked fully into the house. Not belief, not allegiance, just tension. He hugged me normally, kissed my cheek, sat at the table, passed dishes when asked, participated in conversation politely. But his attention kept drifting somewhere slightly behind the room, the way thoughtful people drift inward when multiple versions of something no longer align cleanly inside their head. Halfway through dinner, he asked Stellan whether anyone from his father's side still lived near Mobile. The table quieted for half a second. Stellan answered carefully. Corbin nodded and returned to eating. That was all. But I understood the real question sitting underneath it. How much of my life existed before I was old enough to notice it? I watched my son from across the table and understood something important then. Dorinda had not found deep ground inside him yet, but she had reached the beginning of emotional ambiguity. And ambiguity, left unattended long enough inside families, eventually starts building its own version of history. Corbin passed me the breadbasket without looking up. I took it from him gently. Then I made a decision quietly, right there at the dinner table. I would not rush this, but I would not stay passive either. Some truths require timing, others require stewardship. The mistake would be confusing silence for wisdom just because silence feels calmer in the moment. The first sign came through a woman who understood how fragile perception becomes during the first year after a company goes public. Not fragile financially, fragile narratively. She called me on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing leasing projections for a mixed-use redevelopment outside Montgomery. We had worked together on enough acquisitions over the years that neither of us wasted language unnecessarily. Women who survive long enough in rooms full of expensive men usually learn the value of precision. "Marvin," she said after the greeting portion was over, "this probably isn't anything. But I thought you'd rather hear it early than late." I leaned back slightly in my chair. That wording mattered. Not anything. Yet. I listened. Apparently, a conversation had surfaced during a private lunch involving 2 board members and 1 outside advisor connected to our expansion group. Nothing formal, nothing recorded. The company itself was performing exceptionally well. Revenue projections were ahead of expectation. Leasing activity remained strong. There were no operational concerns. The conversation had been softer than that. Whether recent family visibility around me might become distracting if it expanded publicly in unpredictable ways during a sensitive post-IPO period. Not scandal, not misconduct, just uncertainty. There is a difference. Public companies do not usually panic over private family complications. People divorce every day. Parents embarrass themselves publicly every day. Executives survive ordinary human messiness constantly. But during the first year after an IPO, everyone becomes slightly over-attentive to anything that feels difficult to measure cleanly, especially older board members raised inside reputational cultures where stability itself functions almost like currency. I thanked her for the call and hung up. Then I sat motionless for nearly a minute afterward. Not because I was panicking, but because I was organizing proportions internally before deciding what deserved emotional weight and what did not. The second phone call came 40 minutes later. That one gave me the actual shape of it. A civic beautification fundraiser in Homewood 2 weekends earlier. Gerald had attended representing one of the development groups tied loosely to our downtown expansion. Dorinda had attended as a long-standing committee volunteer. Apparently, they ended up standing near each other during the closing portion of the evening. A conversation happened. 15 minutes at most. No accusations. No dramatic claims. No attacks against me professionally. That part mattered. Because once I understood the actual sequence, I understood almost immediately that Dorinda had probably not entered the conversation intending corporate consequences at all. That was the important distinction. She had most likely done what socially anxious people sometimes do when trying to explain complicated family situations to powerful strangers. Over-explained emotionally. Mentioned reconciliation awkwardly. Mentioned years of estrangement. Mentioned how difficult family healing could be. Perhaps mentioned concern about attention now that the company was public. To Dorinda, that probably felt like vulnerable conversation. To men trained to scan constantly for reputational variables, it translated differently. That is the danger of certain social rooms. One person's emotional processing becomes another person's risk assessment, before either of them fully realizes the conversion happened. I did not call Dorinda. I did not call Gerald. And I did not tell Stellan immediately. Not because I was hiding it. Because I needed to determine first whether this was an actual problem or simply an anxious overcorrection from people unaccustomed to ambiguity around leadership optics. I already had a quarterly board review scheduled for Tuesday morning, so I prepared, not angrily, professionally. By the time Tuesday arrived, every projection had been triple-checked. Every exposure point already had mitigation attached to it before anyone could raise concern aloud. I walked into the meeting carrying the kind of calm that comes from understanding your work completely. No defensiveness, no performance, no visible awareness that any outside conversation had ever occurred. Just command. The meeting lasted under an hour. By the end of it, the room had settled back into the thing rooms like that trust most deeply. Measurable competence. Not charisma, not likability. Competence. No one mentioned my personal life. No one hinted at instability. No one raised reputational concern. And that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever uncertainty had briefly surfaced never developed enough substance to survive direct contact with actual performance. Gerald called me 2 days later. His tone carried the faint embarrassment of a careful man, realizing he had momentarily allowed social ambiguity into a room where it did not belong. He clarified immediately that no formal concern regarding my leadership had ever existed. He said an awkward social conversation had briefly created uncertainty about whether private family reconciliation might attract attention publicly in ways nobody had anticipated. Then he stopped himself slightly. I should have recognized the difference between personal discomfort and material concern earlier than I did, he admitted. That sentence mattered more than the apology itself, because it was accurate. I let him finish. Then I thanked him for the clarification and told him I considered the matter resolved. And I meant it. After the call ended, I sat quietly at my desk, looking out toward the building across the street, carrying my company's name in brushed steel lettering 6 feet high. Then I finally went home and told Stellan. Not every detail. Only the part that mattered. I told him a conversation involving Dorinda had unintentionally reached someone connected to the board through social overlap, that it had not harmed anything materially, but that it briefly introduced uncertainty during a period when public companies tend to over-monitor perception. I was careful with the wording. So was he. He listened without interrupting. The disbelief came first. Not because he thought I was exaggerating, because he had genuinely believed, somewhere underneath all the recent progress, that Dorinda had fully understood the consequences of letting private emotional confusion spill into public spaces. Then I watched something settle inside him quietly, not collapse, adjustment. The difficult recognition that growth and old habits can coexist inside the same person longer than anybody wants them to. He lowered his eyes toward the table for a long moment before finally asking the only question that actually mattered. Do you think she was trying to hurt you? I considered that carefully before answering. No, I said honestly. I think she still doesn't understand how easily certain rooms turn conversation into implication. That landed harder than blame would have, because blame allows clarity. This was murkier than that. Stellan leaned back in his chair and pressed one hand briefly across his mouth. Exhausted, in the particular way people become exhausted when someone they love fails, in a familiar way they had hoped was finally disappearing. I watched another version of his mother leave him quietly in real time. Not the monstrous version, the safer version, the version that believed good intentions automatically prevented damage. I did not interrupt what was happening inside him. Some truths need silence around them before they finish becoming real. The invitation came by text, warm, casual, the kind of message that assumes acceptance. a family dinner at Dorinda's home. Sunday evening. She had been cooking all day, she said. She wanted everyone together. The phrasing was inclusive and easy and gave no indication of anything underneath it. I read it twice. Then I told Stellan we would go. He looked at me for a moment. You sure? Yes. I was already thinking about what to wear. We arrived to find the extended family already seated. The same faces from the corridor, from the formal dinner, from every chapter of this story that had required witnesses. They greeted us with the careful warmth of people who were still deciding how to position themselves relative to everything that had shifted in recent months. I moved through the greetings smoothly, unhurried, shaking hands and accepting embraces with the ease of a woman who had nothing to prove in any room she entered. Then I found my seat. Dorinda had arranged the table with precision. I will give her that. My place was at the far end, away from the natural center of conversation, positioned between two extended family members I had met fewer than 3 times in 20 years. Stellan was seated closer to his mother's end. The children were distributed in between. It was arranged to look like nothing in particular and function as something very specific. A table that had a center and a periphery and had placed me firmly in the latter. I sat down without adjusting anything. I unfolded my napkin and I smiled at the woman to my left, and I asked her how her drive had been. The evening moved the way Dorinda had designed it to move. Conversations flowed toward her end of the table. Corbin's name came up, his career, his achievements, narrated by Dorinda to the room with the quiet possessiveness of a woman claiming credit through proximity. As though the man my son had become had roots in this house, rather than in mine. I listened to it and kept my expression pleasant and stored every word. I was halfway through my meal when I noticed Zuri. She had been watching the table, not obviously. My daughter is too much her mother's child for obvious. But she had been watching, and at some point during the second course, she picked up her plate, her glass, and her silverware, and moved her chair 3 feet down the table, closer to my end. She resettled herself without announcement, without explanation, without making eye contact with anyone who might require one. She picked up her fork and continued eating. I said nothing. I did not look at her for longer than a breath. But I felt something move through me quietly. The specific satisfaction of watching your child use a skill you never taught her directly, because she had been paying attention closely enough to develop it on her own. Dorinda noticed. I watched her notice. She said nothing either. Across the table, Stellan caught my eye once. Just once. And in that single exchange, I received everything he intended to send. He had seen the seating. He had seen Zuri move. He had seen all of it. And he was still exactly where he had been since the night I told him about Gerald. We left together at 8:30. In the car, he reached over and put his hand on mine. I turned my hand over and held his back. Neither of us said a word for the first 5 minutes of the drive. We didn't need to. She arranged that evening to remind me where she thought I belonged. I sat through every minute of it and never moved from where I actually stood. I heard it on a Tuesday evening without meaning to. Zuri was in the living room on the phone with a friend, speaking with the easy openness people only use when they feel emotionally safe and completely unobserved. I was coming down the hallway with a basket of folded laundry balanced against my hip when I caught Dorinda's name in the middle of a laugh and slowed instinctively before I even realized I had done it. Not to eavesdrop. To understand the warmth in my daughter's voice. That was what stopped me. She was talking about her grandmother the way daughters talk about people who have settled naturally into their emotional lives. Not cautiously, not analytically, comfortably. She said Dorinda had surprised her, that she was thoughtful in small ways that felt real instead of performative, that she remembered details from previous conversations and circled back to them later without needing reminders, that she called simply to ask how her week was going instead of only appearing when something emotional or symbolic was happening. Then Zuri laughed softly and said the sentence that held me still in that hallway. "I think this is the first time I've ever felt like I actually have a grandmother." I tightened my grip slightly on the laundry basket and stared down at the hardwood floor for a moment without moving. Not because the sentence hurt me personally, because of what sat underneath it. My daughter had reached adulthood carrying an absence she had learned not to examine too closely, because her father and I had spent 20 years arranging silence carefully enough that she could grow around it without feeling deformed by it. And now that absence was suddenly filling in, naturally, openly, without suspicion. What I felt standing there was not jealousy. I need to be exact about that, because imprecise emotions create imprecise decisions, and I had worked too hard over too many years to become careless with either. It was grief, a very particular kind. The grief of watching your child offer trust freely in a direction where you yourself had only ever learned caution. Zuri had no internal file on Dorinda, no catalog of social tells, no memory of that corridor. No understanding of what it means when a person measures rooms before they emotionally enter them. She had simply encountered warmth and responded honestly to it. There is something beautiful about that, and something terrifying. I carried the laundry upstairs without interrupting her conversation. Later that night, I stood in my bathroom removing my earrings and asked myself a question I had been avoiding quietly for weeks. Was I protecting my daughter? Or was I protecting the version of Dorinda I still needed Zuri to believe existed? That question stayed with me longer than I expected. Over the next 2 weeks, I began paying closer attention, not emotionally, practically. I stopped relying only on instinct and started observing behavior the way I would evaluate any other developing situation involving people I loved. Patterns, consistency, follow-through. I asked Reed 2 careful questions during a phone call one Thursday afternoon. Nothing dramatic enough to sound investigative. Simply whether Dorinda had been keeping up with her medical appointments lately and whether her mood had remained stable outside family settings too. He answered both without hesitation. Yes. And yes. I noticed other things myself. Dorinda never pushed for private emotional disclosures from Zuri, never fished for information about me through her, never tried turning ordinary disagreements into opportunities for alignment. When Zuri spoke, Dorinda listened more than she redirected. That mattered. So did the restraint. Manipulative people usually accelerate once emotional access is granted. Dorinda wasn't accelerating. She was moving carefully, almost cautiously. A Sunday visit happened during that period that I only learned about afterward. Zuri mentioned it casually while reaching into the refrigerator for orange juice the next morning. She and Dorinda had lunch together after church. No secrecy attached to it. No defensive explanation. Just ordinary information offered by a daughter who had not yet learned to think of her grandmother as someone requiring emotional management before contact. I nodded and asked how the restaurant was. That was all. But after she left for work, I stood alone in my kitchen longer than necessary, thinking about what restraint actually requires from a parent once their children become adults. Because the truth was this. I could have sat Zuri down at any moment and emptied 20 years into her lap. I could have described the corridor, the spit, the silence afterward, the phone calls never made, the birthdays ignored, the graduation seats left empty. And maybe she would have pulled away from Dorinda immediately after hearing it. Maybe. But there is a difference between informing your child and recruiting them emotionally into your unresolved pain. Too many parents cross that line without realizing it. I refused to. That did not mean I intended to stay passive. It meant I needed to choose carefully where protection ended and control began. One evening the following week, Zuri sat at the kitchen counter while I cooked, talking absently about work politics and a co-worker she didn't trust fully. I listened while seasoning chicken at the stove and waited until the conversation settled naturally before I spoke. People are most themselves when they think no one important is watching. The kitchen quieted slightly after I said it. Zuri looked up from her phone, not confused, thoughtful, like somebody receiving a sentence she recognized immediately as carrying more weight than the room around it. "What made you think of that?" she asked. I turned the chicken once in the pan before answering. Experience. She watched me for another second. Then she nodded slowly and looked back down at her phone, but I could feel her still thinking about the sentence afterward. That mattered more than explanation would have. I was not trying to make my daughter suspicious of her grandmother. I was trying to give her a tool, a quiet one, something small enough to carry without damaging her softness, because softness was not the problem. Blindness was. And there is a difference between the two that took me half my life to learn properly. Reed called me on a Thursday afternoon. He did not waste time with small talk. Reed never does. He said he had been at Dorinda's house the previous Saturday, helping her move some old storage boxes out of the garage, and that something had happened while he was there that he thought I should know about. His tone told me this was not gossip. It was observation. There is a difference. I told him to go ahead. Zuri had stopped by sometime after lunch. Apparently those visits had become semi-regular over the past month, not scheduled formally, just the kind of casual stopping by that happens when familiarity begins settling into a relationship naturally. Tea. Conversation. A trip through old family photographs Dorinda had started pulling out for her little by little. That detail caught my attention immediately. Photographs. Dorinda had spent 20 years avoiding evidence of absence. Now she was voluntarily opening boxes full of it. Reed said the afternoon had been ordinary at first, comfortable even. Zuri had been helping Dorinda identify people in old pictures, while Dorinda filled in names and stories. Some of them harmless. Some of them carrying the strange, emotional stiffness of a woman trying to narrate family history, while quietly editing herself out of the ugliest parts of it. At some point, Dorinda stepped outside to check on something near the side yard where a sprinkler line had apparently burst earlier that week. Zuri stayed in the sitting room and called a friend. Reed had been in the kitchen sorting papers at the table. He could hear her voice clearly enough to understand tone, but not every exact word. What carried most was warmth. Easy, unguarded warmth. The sound of somebody speaking openly about a person they had grown genuinely attached to. A few minutes later, Dorinda came back inside through the side entrance and stopped. Reed said she froze in the hallway when she heard Zuri talking. Not dramatically. Not like someone overhearing scandal. More like someone accidentally walking into a room carrying a truth they had not prepared themselves to hear. She stayed there listening. Zuri was describing her grandmother to whoever was on the other end of the call. Not sentimentally, not naively, just honestly. She said Dorinda had become different over the past few months. Softer in some ways. More thoughtful than she expected. The kind of person who remembered details from previous conversations and followed up on them later. Someone who called just to ask how an interview went or whether she'd eaten. Then came the sentence that seemed to settle hardest. "The weird thing is," Zuri had said, laughing softly, "I think she actually tries really hard with me." Reed said Dorinda closed her eyes when she heard that. Not crying, not collapsing, just stopping. He said he had known Dorinda most of his adult life and had spent decades watching her operate inside social rooms with complete command of herself. Even after the dinner. Even after the confession in front of the family. There had always still been some visible structure holding her upright internally, some defended version of herself managing what entered and what did not. But standing in that hallway, listening to Zuri speak about her with uncomplicated affection, something in that structure appeared to shift unexpectedly. Not break, shift. Reed described it carefully because he knew better than to overstate things with me. He said it looked less like guilt and more like recognition arriving too fast for somebody to organize themselves around it properly. That felt true to me immediately, because guilt still allows a person to remain the center of the story. Recognition does not. Recognition forces a person to confront the possibility that someone they harmed built goodness anyway, not because of them, not through them, but entirely outside the architecture of what they believed about the world. And that realization changes the proportions of things. Zuri finished the call a few minutes later and gathered her purse to leave. Dorinda walked her to the door. Reed said the hug between them lasted slightly longer than usual. Not emotional enough for Zuri to notice anything strange, but long enough that Reed noticed Dorinda holding on a fraction past the natural end of it, like someone reluctant to release contact with something they had not expected to matter this much. After Zuri left, Dorinda came back inside and sat down in the hallway, not in a chair, on the floor, her back against the wall, still completely composed from the outside, according to Reed. No crying, no dramatic breakdown, just unusually quiet. He made coffee and handed her a cup and sat nearby without speaking. Eventually, she said something. Only one sentence. Reed repeated it to me exactly the way she had said it. I missed her entire life, and she still came toward me open-handed. That landed harder than anything else in the story. Because that sentence did not sound like a woman trying to repair her image. It sounded like a woman beginning, for the first time, to understand the scale of what she forfeited while protecting her pride. Reed told me they sat there another 20 minutes before Dorinda stood back up and resumed the afternoon like nothing unusual had happened. He thought I should know. I thanked him for the call and hung up. Then I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time, holding what he had told me carefully in both hands internally, turning it over slowly. Not with triumph. I need to be precise about that. There was no satisfaction in it for me, no feeling of victory. This was not a strategy successfully completed. It was something far less clean than that, because the truth was, Dorinda had not changed from one phone call. The shift had started long before that hallway. It started at the dinner table, at the photographs, at Corbin's restraint, at Stellan's distance, at the realization that time had continued building a family without her inside it. And somewhere along the way, my daughter, simply by being fully herself without suspicion or performance, had forced Dorinda to confront a version of love she had spent most of her life believing she understood, while never actually practicing it properly. The sentence I gave Zuri months ago came back to me then. People are most themselves when they think no one important is watching. The irony was that Zuri had never needed the lesson. Dorinda did. And somehow my daughter taught it to her without ever realizing she was standing in front of the classroom. Dorinda called on a Monday morning. No careful lead-in, no emotional framing. She simply asked whether she could come by sometime that week if I had room in my schedule. Something in her voice made me stop turning the page I had been reading. It was quieter than usual, but not weak, less arranged, less curated. Dorinda normally placed language carefully before releasing it into a room, especially emotional language. This sounded different, like somebody too tired to keep adjusting proportions before speaking. I noticed it immediately. I told her Wednesday morning worked. She thanked me softly and ended the call. I did not mention it to Stellan until the following evening, not because I intended secrecy, because I needed a little time alone with my own instincts before anyone else's interpretation entered the space around them. Something had shifted in Dorinda after Reed's phone call. I knew that much already. What I did not yet know was whether the shift was temporary emotion or structural change. Those are not the same thing. People mistake emotional exhaustion for transformation every day. I had no intention of making that mistake. She arrived Wednesday at 11, exactly. No list. I had not expected another one, but I still noticed the absence immediately anyway. The first time she came to this house, she carried herself like a woman entering negotiation. Shoulders forward slightly, purse held tightly, emotional positioning already prepared before the door even opened. This time, she stood differently. Looser somehow. Not relaxed, just less defended. I also noticed she looked tired in a way sleep does not fix. The kind of tiredness that settles into people after maintaining an internal argument too long. I led her into the sitting room and closed the door behind us. She sat down carefully and looked at her hands for a moment before looking back up at me. I remained exactly where I was, across from her, waiting. And then she began. Not with apology, with accuracy. That mattered. She named the corridor, the dress, the exact words she used. She did not soften them this time, did not summarize them into mistakes or things said in anger. She repeated them plainly and let them exist in the room at full size. Then she talked about the years afterward, not defensively, almost clinically at first. The explanations she built for herself over time, the ways she convinced herself the estrangement represented principle rather than pride, how she turned silence into evidence that she had been right all along, how every year she stayed away made returning emotionally harder because returning would require admitting the previous year had also been wrong. That part felt painfully true to me immediately. People rarely stay trapped inside one bad decision because the decision itself is comfortable. They stay because undoing it threatens the version of themselves they built around surviving it. Dorinda admitted things unevenly. That was what made it believable. Some sentences came easily. Others seemed to catch against something sharp internally before she could force them the rest of the way out. Twice, she stopped mid-thought and restarted the sentence differently. I watched all of it quietly, especially the places where instinct still tried reaching for self-protection before honesty interrupted it halfway through. That was the part that convinced me most. Not the confession. The struggle inside it. Finally, she looked at me and said something without preparation behind it. I kept thinking time would eventually make me feel justified. The room stayed quiet afterward. She looked down briefly and shook her head once. But all it did was make the distance normal. That sentence landed differently than the others. Because there it was, the actual tragedy underneath all 20 years of it. Not hatred surviving, habit surviving, the normalization of absence. I sat across from her without moving, receiving every word the same way I received the list months earlier, without interruption, without visible reaction, without helping her emotionally through any part of what she chose to say. The silence stretched between us for a while after she finished. Then I asked the question I had been carrying since Reed called me 8 days earlier. I kept my tone level. No accusation, no performance. If the company had never gone public, would you still be sitting here? Dorinda inhaled once, but did not answer immediately. I watched the instinct arrive first. The small, reflexive movement toward safety people make when they recognize a question capable of exposing them fully if answered honestly. For half a second, I thought she might reach for the cleaner version. The socially survivable one. She almost did. I'd like to think so, she said quietly at first. Then she stopped herself. Actually stopped. I watched the correction happen in real time. Her mouth tightened slightly, Her eyes lowered toward her hands. When she spoke again, the second answer sounded harder to say than the first. "No," she admitted finally. Or maybe not. The room stayed still around that sentence. She gave a faint shake of her head afterward, more to herself than to me. "Not this soon," she added softly. "Maybe not before something forced me to look at it properly." That felt true. Messy. Incomplete. Human. Not the polished honesty people perform when they already know exactly who they became at the end of a lesson. This sounded like somebody still arriving there while speaking. I sat with it quietly, not shocked by the answer itself. Some part of me had understood that already long before asking the question. What affected me was the fact that she corrected herself instead of protecting herself. A woman still fully invested in image management would have taken the first answer and stayed there. Dorinda didn't. She let the uglier truth remain in the room after it appeared. That mattered more than certainty would have. I let the silence settle naturally before speaking again. "Thank you for telling me the real version." And I meant it. Not as forgiveness, not as absolution, as information. Useful information. Possibly the most useful thing she had ever given me. Because honesty delivered late is still honesty. And sometimes the difference between change and performance is simply whether a person keeps correcting themselves after the easier answer becomes available. Restoration does not look the way people imagine it will. It does not arrive as a single, clean moment where everyone finally understands each other and all the damage settles neatly into the past. It arrives unevenly, quietly, in fragments small enough that you sometimes miss them while they are happening, and only recognize them later when you realize the room feels different than it used to. There are still evenings when I leave the table and stand alone in my kitchen for a minute before returning. Not because I am falling apart, because memory has texture. Sometimes Dorinda says something harmless in a tone that brushes against an older version of her, and suddenly I am back in that corridor for half a breath, young again, standing in white fabric while people decided what kind of human being I was allowed to be in front of them. Those moments still happen, less often now, but they happen. I let them happen. Then I wash my hands at the sink or straighten something already straight on the counter, and I walk back into the dining room as the woman I chose to become, rather than the woman that hallway tried to reduce me to. That is what healing actually looks like from inside it. Not clean, practiced. Corbin knows more now than he did a year ago. Not because I sat him down and delivered some dramatic account of everything his grandmother did. That would have turned truth into theater, and I had no interest in performing my pain for my son. Instead, Stellan started talking, slowly at first, unevenly, in the careful rhythm of a man who spent most of his adult life sealing difficult things inside himself and is now learning how to bring them into daylight without feeling disloyal for doing it. Sometimes he would tell Corbin one story during a drive somewhere, sometimes another while helping him move furniture or fix something around the house. Never speeches, never emotional unloading. Just honest sentences arriving where silence used to live. Corbin listened, asked questions, sat with answers. Some of those conversations unsettled him more than he expected. I could see it. There's a particular disappointment that comes with realizing the adults who raised you were carrying realities you were never close enough to fully see. One evening, he came by after dinner and found me in the kitchen alone. He sat at the counter for a while before speaking. "I didn't understand what you carried," he said quietly. I kept drying the same plate while he said it. Then I told him the truth. "You weren't supposed to." He looked at me. I set the plate down carefully before continuing. "I didn't survive all of that, so my children could inherit it as identity. That stayed between us for a while after I said it. Then he nodded once and asked if I needed help putting the dishes away. That was my son. No dramatic emotional collapse, just presence. Zuri and Dorinda built something too, though theirs remains more fragile than either of them fully admits aloud. Zuri loves openly. Dorinda still loves defensively. You can see it in the small moments if you watch closely enough. Sometimes Dorinda reaches naturally for affection, and then seems to catch herself halfway through it, like warmth still feels unfamiliar in certain emotional directions. There are moments when Zuri hugs her, and Dorinda stiffens for 1 second, before relaxing into it afterward. Tiny delays, tiny hesitations. Most people would miss them. Zuri doesn't. One afternoon, she mentioned it while helping me prepare dinner. Sometimes Grandma acts like she wants closeness and doesn't trust it at the same time. I glanced at her across the counter. That's probably true, I said. Zuri thought about that quietly while slicing tomatoes. Then she said something that sat with me longer than she realized. I think she keeps waiting for somebody to punish her even when nobody is. There it was, the thing underneath all of it. Not just guilt, expectation of exile. I looked at my daughter standing there in my kitchen. This young woman who had entered the situation without bitterness and somehow still managed to see complexity clearly without losing softness in the process. And I understood that she had become something larger than the damage she came from. Maybe, I said carefully. But consequences and punishment aren't always the same thing. Zuri looked at me for a moment like she was filing the sentence away somewhere private for later. Then she nodded. Stellan carries himself differently now too. Lighter in some places, sadder in others. The guilt is no longer hidden inside him where it quietly controls the architecture of his silence. Now it sits where it belongs. In the past, named properly, examined openly when necessary instead of privately managed until it hardens into distance. There are still nights when he apologizes unexpectedly for things neither of us can change anymore. Not performatively, just softly, in passing. Sometimes while locking the doors before bed. Sometimes while folding laundry. Ordinary moments. That is where real remorse lives most of the time. Not in speeches, but in repetition. And Dorinda. Dorinda still measures rooms sometimes. I notice it immediately every time it happens. The old instinct surfaces without warning now and then. The assessing glance, the social recalculation, the reflexive positioning she spent decades mistaking for control. Age did not erase that part of her. It simply made it easier to see. But now she notices it too. That is the difference. There are moments after she says something slightly sharp or overly careful where I watch realization cross her face half a second later. The recognition, the correction, the quiet pulling back. She is learning herself late. That is difficult work for anyone, especially for someone who spent most of her life convinced she already understood who she was. Sometimes she sits at my table very quietly while the rest of us talk around her, and I catch her watching the room with an expression I could not have imagined on her 20 years ago. Not guilt, not shame, grief. The slow understanding of how much life continued happening while she stood outside it, protecting her pride. I do not rescue her from that feeling. Some understandings deserve to finish arriving fully. I never paid evil back with evil. Not because I was above it. Because I understood something Dorinda didn't understand then. Hatred always believes it is building hierarchy. But what it actually builds is distance. And distance, if you leave it standing long enough, eventually becomes loneliness. Every choice I made instead of retaliation became a brick. Every silence I handled carefully. Every boundary. Every refusal to become cruel just because cruelty had been offered to me first. brick by brick. And now, when I sit at my table and look around the room, at my husband finally speaking honestly, my son understanding quietly, my daughter loving carefully, and the woman who once spat on my wedding dress sitting there learning how to live truthfully inside proximity instead of prejudice, I understand what those bricks built. Not perfection. Something harder to build than that. A family forced to become honest before it could become whole.